A Christmas Carol, Part 3, Stave 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of the neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, a heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12? It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12? He touched the spring of his repeater to correct the most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and that this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with his sleeve, the sleeve of his dressing gown, before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had been off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of the first exchange, paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge of his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there was no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 more quarters, when he remembered of a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution of his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced that he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "Ding dong! A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong! Half past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong! A quarter to 1," said Scrooge. "Ding dong!" The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow melancholy. 1. Light flashed up the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Now the curtains at his feet. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck, was down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, more delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and its singular contradiction of that wintry emblem had its dress trimmed with summer flowers, but the strangest thing about it was that from the crown on its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible, and which all was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cape, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not in its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered, now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctiveness, but now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close behind him, it was at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cape, and begged him to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give you? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cape, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wildly bonneted the spirit at any period of his life, and then he made a bold inquiry of what business brought him here. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then? Take heed." It put out a strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purpose, that bed was warm, at the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he had clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made toward the window, clasped its rose in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As these words were spoken, they passed through the wall, and they stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and incestuous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts of hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip is trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered, with his unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it? Cried Scrooge with fervor. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let's go on in. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance with its bridge, its church, and its winding river. Some saggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys, and country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. Those are but shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. The travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eyes glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at cross roads and by ways for several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas? What good had it ever done to him? The school is not quite deserted, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left still there. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathered clock surmounted on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of the broken fortunes for the spacious office were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a laden echo in the house, not a squeak and a scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the hall, the half-thwarted water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clinking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence, and gave a freer passage of his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. Why, it's Ali Baba! Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. It's dear old honest Ali Baba! Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come. For the first time, just like that poor boy. And Valentine, said Scrooge, and his wild brother Orson. There they go. And what's his name, who was put down his drawers asleep at the gate of the Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie? There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess? To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on subjects in most extraordinary voices, between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, and a thing like a lettuce growing out the top of his head. There he is! Poor Robinson Crusoe, we called him when he came home again after sailing around the island. Poor Robinson Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday running for his life to the little creek. Hallo, hop, hallo. Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in a pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it is too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. Should have liked to give him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying, as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was a quite correct, that everything had happened so, and there he was alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for their jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and, with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan," returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. The home That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and are never to come back here. But first we're to be together all Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world." "You're quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness toward the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. Terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there." And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with the ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of shivering best parlor that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those deities to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked of the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he'd rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good night, good-bye, right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, and quick wheels dashing the frost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Always delicate creatures whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gains, gainsay it, spirit, God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost, your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but the moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfare of a city whose shadowy passenger passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. Why, I apprenticed here. Then went in, at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig, alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo ho there, Ebenezer! Scrooge, former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig, with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in place, 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em up, 7, 8, 9, and came back yet before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hi ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let us have lots of room. Here, hilly ho! Chirp! Ebenezer! Clear away! There was nothing that wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, and it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom you would ever desire to sit upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. It came. Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled up by her mistress. If they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling, and they all came. And how, and every how, away they all went, 20 couple at once. hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round, various stages of affectionate groupings. Old top couples always turning up in the wrong places, new top couples starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not at the bottom one to help out. When the result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dancing, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter especially provided for the purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, and there was no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight. There were more dancers, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and there was plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have ever told it to him, struck up the Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig started out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couples too, with good stiff pieces of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pairs of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, all 4 times old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If not high praise, tell me higher and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves that shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted and given times that would become of the next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had got all through the dance, advanced and retired, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on each side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wishing him or her a Merry Christmas, with everybody had retired but 2 apprentices that did the same to them, and thus cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon his head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge.